The hegemony had a delightfully bureaucratic way of categorizing planets that would kill you. Class X meant probably fatal within hours. Class XX meant definitely fatal within minutes. And then there was Nexus 7, which had earned the rarely bestowed Class 30 rating, reserved for worlds so aggressively hostile that even looking at them through a telescope might give you indigestion. The planet hung in space like a green marble designed by a particularly vindictive deity. Its surface writhed with vegetation so dense that atmospheric readings suggested the jungle had developed its own weather patterns. 3 separate species had attempted colonization over the past 2 centuries. The crystalline hegemony had lost an entire research station to what their reports diplomatically termed aggressive botanical phenomena. The Aquatic Confederacy's survey team had lasted exactly 47 minutes before their environmental suits were dissolved by airborne spores that apparently viewed advanced polymers as afternoon snacks. Most recently, the Insectoid Empire's military expedition had been forced to retreat when the local fauna began using their landing craft as nesting material. Captain Wex of the research vessel Probability's End had read all these reports with the sort of professional interest one reserves for particularly creative disaster scenarios. Her crystalline form refracted the bridge's lighting into prismatic patterns as she reviewed the data for the 100th time, each facet of her body catching and splitting the information displays into rainbow cascades. Remind me again why we're approaching a planet that has a documented history of eating visitors, she said, her voice carrying that peculiar harmonic quality that came from vocal cords made of living crystal. Dr. Cornelius Bram, whose tentacles were currently interfacing with multiple data streams simultaneously, rippled with what might have been amusement. His aquatic heritage meant he viewed most terrestrial environments as inconveniently dry, but even he had to admit that Nexus 7 took hostility to impressive extremes. "Scientific curiosity, Captain," he replied, his translator converting the complex chemical signals of his native language into something approximating smugness. The hegemony's xenobiological division has developed new theoretical models for extreme ecosystem analysis. We're here to prove that no environment is truly incompatible with proper scientific methodology. Navigator Yuki Osten clicked her mandibles in what her species considered polite skepticism. Her compound eyes processed the sensor data with mechanical precision, each facet analyzing different spectrums of information. "The theoretical models are fascinating, Doctor, but the practical applications seem somewhat limited when the ecosystem in question actively dissolves research equipment." Pessimism. Bram's tentacles waved dismissively, causing several data streams to flicker. The previous expeditions lacked proper preparation and theoretical framework. They approached Nexus 7 with the assumption that adaptation was required, when clearly the solution is technological superiority. Commander Pax Neville, whose reptilian ancestors had conquered 3-star systems through the simple expedient of being harder to kill than their opposition, studied the tactical displays with professional interest. His scaled hide bore the scars of a dozen different wars, and his experience had taught him that the universe had a sense of humor about things that seemed impossible. "The energy readings are anomalous," he observed, his forked tongue tasting the recycled air of the bridge. "According to our sensors, there are heat signatures consistent with controlled combustion scattered across the primary continent." "Volcanic activity," Bram said immediately. "The geological surveys indicate significant tectonic instability." "These signatures are too regular," Neville insisted. "They're occurring in patterns that suggest artificial origin. Specifically, they're clustering around what our botanical scans indicate are the most hostile regions of the jungle." Wex rotated her crystalline head, refracting her attention across multiple displays. The data was indeed curious. Heat signatures that pulsed with organic rhythms, arranged in configurations that suggested deliberate placement. Most intriguingly, the atmospheric composition showed trace elements that shouldn't exist in a purely natural ecosystem. Perhaps the planet has developed some form of chemosynthetic intelligence, Yuki suggested, her compound eyes tracking the data flows. Certain fungal networks can achieve remarkable complexity given sufficient time and environmental pressure. Or, Neville said with the sort of tone that suggested he was about to propose something either brilliant or catastrophically stupid. Something is actually living down there. The bridge fell silent except for the gentle hum of life support systems and the occasional harmonic resonance from Wex's crystalline structure. The idea that anything could survive on Nexus 7 wasn't just improbable, it was mathematically offensive. The hegemony's best minds had calculated the precise ways the planet would kill potential inhabitants. The atmospheric chemistry alone should have been lethal to most known forms of life, and that was before considering the documented carnivorous vegetation and the airborne pathogens that treated organic matter as a buffet selection. Impossible, Bram stated with the confidence of someone whose tentacles had interfaced with very reliable databases. The environmental parameters are incompatible with complex life forms. The pH levels of the surface water would dissolve most organic compounds, the atmospheric pressure variations would rupture cellular structures, and the documented flora produces toxins that are lethal to every known biological classification. And yet, Wex said, studying the energy patterns with growing curiosity, something is generating those heat signatures, something that appears to be maintaining regular schedules and organized distribution patterns. The research vessel Probability's End continued its approach, its sensors painting an increasingly detailed picture of a world that should have been empty, but clearly wasn't. The jungle canopy stretched across continents, dense enough to hide entire ecosystems beneath its green expanse. Rivers meandered through the vegetation like silver threads, carrying sediments that the ship's analyzers found disturbingly complex. Captain, Yuki's voice carried a note of confusion that rarely entered her precisely calibrated communications. I'm detecting structured modifications to the vegetation patterns. There appear to be clearings, arranged in geometric configurations. Natural phenomena, Bram insisted, though his tentacles were beginning to twitch in ways that suggested his certainty was developing hairline cracks. Symbiotic relationships between different plant species can create surprisingly regular distributions. These clearings contain artificial structures, Yuki continued, her compound eyes processing spectral analyses that made no sense according to established xenobiological principles. I'm reading what appear to be elevated platforms constructed from local materials but arranged using engineering principles. Neville's scarred hide rippled with anticipation. Habitation. Impossible habitation, Yuki corrected. The structures are positioned in areas where our models indicate the environmental hostility should be at maximum levels. Whatever built them would have had to survive direct exposure to atmospheric conditions that should liquefy organic tissue. Wex made a decision that would later be studied in several academic papers and at least one court-martial hearing. Prepare a landing party, she ordered. Full environmental protection, maximum sensor suite, and enough scientific arrogance to pretend we know what we're doing. Captain, Bram protested, his tentacles now actively writhing with professional anxiety. The safety protocols clearly state that Class XXX worlds require remote observation only. Direct surface contact is prohibited without Hegemony Council approval. The Hegemony Council classified this planet based on the assumption that nothing could survive here, Wex replied, her crystalline structure refracting her growing excitement into prismatic patterns across the bridge. If something is not only surviving but apparently thriving, then our classifications might need some adjustment. As Probability's End entered orbital insertion, its sensors continued their impossible documentation of a world that shouldn't work, but obviously did. Somewhere far below, in a jungle that 3 civilizations had declared uninhabitable, Something was going about its daily routine with what could only be described as offensive normalcy. The universe, it seemed, had developed opinions about expert predictions. The landing shuttle, theoretical certainty, descended through Nexus 7's atmosphere with all the confidence of a scientific theory about to meet an inconvenient fact. Its hull bristled with enough sensors, protective fields, and emergency systems to survive a brief visit to a small star, which the crew felt might be adequate for a planet that had merely killed every previous expedition. Commander Neville piloted the craft with the steady hands of someone who had crash-landed on 17 different worlds and lived to file the paperwork. His environmental suit was a marvel of defensive engineering, designed to protect against atmospheric toxins, aggressive microorganisms, and what the technical specifications diplomatically termed hostile biological interactions. Atmospheric composition holding steady at previously recorded levels, reported Dr. Bram, his tentacles interfacing with multiple environmental monitors through specially designed ports in his suit. pH readings indicate the air itself should be dissolving our equipment within minutes. Optimistic as always, Doctor, Neville replied, adjusting their descent vector to avoid what appeared to be a flock of something that registered on sensors as both flora and fauna simultaneously. Navigator Yuki, what's our target zone looking like? Yuki's compound eyes processed multiple spectrums through her suit's enhanced visual systems. What she saw made several of her optical processors pause to double-check their calibration. Commander, the target area shows clear signs of environmental modification. There are what appear to be cultivated gardens integrated into the natural jungle structure. Define cultivated, Bram demanded, his scientific skepticism fighting a losing battle against increasingly impossible sensor data. The vegetation has been arranged in aesthetic patterns that serve no apparent survival function. Yuki replied with the precision of someone describing a mathematical impossibility. There are also structures that appear to be decorative. The shuttle touched down in a clearing that had obviously been prepared for visitors, complete with what could only be described as a landing pad made from woven vines and polished stones. The engineering was primitive by hegemony standards, but undeniably functional, and more disturbingly, it showed signs of regular maintenance. Atmospheric readings confirm previous data, Bram announced as they prepared for surface contact. The air contains 17 different compounds that should be immediately fatal to organic life. The humidity levels would cause instant cellular rupture in most known species, and the local microbial population appears to view foreign organic matter as a recreational drug. Wonderful, Neville muttered, checking his weapon systems. Nothing like a planet where the bacteria get high off visitors. They emerged from the shuttle into what should have been a death trap, but felt remarkably like a garden party hosted by someone with unusual tastes in landscaping. The jungle pressed in around them with aggressive vitality, but it was contained by paths that showed clear signs of regular use. Flowering vines had been trained to grow in patterns that were undeniably artistic, and several trees bore what appeared to be deliberately cultivated fruit that glowed with soft bioluminescence. "This is impossible," Bram stated, his tentacles twitching as his instruments registered readings that violated several fundamental principles of xenobiology. The local flora should be actively attempting to consume us. Instead, it appears to be maintained. Maybe it's learned some manners, Neville suggested, though his hand remained near his weapon as they followed a well-worn path deeper into the supposedly hostile jungle. The path itself was an exercise in impossibility. It meandered through groves of trees that previous expeditions had documented as aggressively carnivorous, but these specimens appeared to have been convinced to limit their dietary preferences to non-sentient prey. Flowers that the Aquatic Confederacy's reports described as chemically aggressive swayed gently in the breeze, their potentially lethal beauty contained by ingenious arrangements of companion plants that seemed to neutralize their more antisocial tendencies. "Commander," Yuki's voice carried a note of professional bewilderment. I'm detecting elevated platforms approximately 40 meters ahead. The construction appears to utilize local materials, but incorporates engineering principles that suggest advanced understanding of structural dynamics. They rounded a bend in the path and stopped as their collective worldviews performed emergency recalibrations. Rising through the canopy was a structure that could only be described as a treehouse, though calling it that was like calling a symphony a collection of noises. It spiraled up through multiple levels, connected by bridges and platforms that seemed to grow from the living wood itself. Windows had been carefully carved to preserve the tree's structural integrity while providing optimal lighting and ventilation. And on the highest accessible platform, approximately 40 feet above the jungle floor, sat a human. He was having tea. The human appeared to be middle-aged by his species standards, with graying hair and the sort of casual demeanor one associates with people who have found their perfect spot in the universe and settled in for the duration. His clothing was practical but well-maintained, clearly adapted for the local environment, but showing none of the desperate improvisation one might expect from a stranded survivor. He sat at a small table that had been carved from a single piece of local wood, with a proper tea service arranged with the precision of someone who took afternoon refreshments seriously. "Gentlemen," he called down an accented standard, his voice carrying the sort of pleasant warmth usually reserved for greeting expected guests. "And lady, of course. Bit early for tea time by local standards, but I suppose interdimensional visitors work on their own schedules." The three members of the landing party stood in collective silence, their environmental suits protecting them from an atmosphere that should have killed them while they stared up at a human who was clearly thriving in conditions that the galaxy's best scientists had declared unsurvivable. "Are you?" Neville began, then stopped as his training and first contact protocols collided headfirst with the complete absence of any procedures for this situation. "Elias Hemsworth." The human replied cheerfully, raising his teacup in a gesture that was either greeting or salute. "And you're the first visitors I've had in..." He paused thoughtfully. "Must be going on 3 years now. The last ones were those insectoid fellows with the excellent military discipline, but absolutely no appreciation for proper brewing techniques." "You're alive," Bram stated, his tentacles performing calculations that kept arriving at mathematically impossible conclusions. "Last I checked," Elias agreed, "though I suppose that depends on your definition of alive. I've been here about 15 years now, and the local ecosystem and I have reached what you might call an understanding." "Understanding," Yuki repeated, her compound eyes processing the scene with the systematic precision of someone cataloging a natural phenomenon that violated natural law. "Well, certainly," Elias said, setting down his teacup and gesturing at the jungle around them. "Bit of a learning curve at first, I'll admit. The plants here are remarkably social once you get to know them properly. And the local fauna has fascinating opinions about proper territory management." As if summoned by his words, something that looked like a cross between a leopard and a flowering shrub emerged from the undergrowth and padded over to the base of Elias's tree. It looked up at him with eyes like blooming orchids and made a sound that was part purr, part rustling leaves. "That's Blossom," Elias explained casually. "She helps with pest control in exchange for the occasional fruit and some very specific varieties of fungi that grow in the compost system." "Pest control," Neville repeated, his weapon systems automatically targeting the creature before his conscious mind reminded him that it was apparently domesticated. "Oh yes, the jungle has quite a complex ecosystem," Elias continued, climbing down from his platform with the casual ease of someone who had been making the trip daily for over a decade. "Lots of territorial disputes between the more aggressive species. Blossom and her family keep the really antisocial ones away from the inhabited areas in exchange for some environmental modifications that suit their preferences." He reached the ground and extended a hand in the universal gesture of greeting, seemingly oblivious to the fact that he was standing unprotected in an atmosphere that should have dissolved him minutes ago. "I don't suppose any of you would care for some tea?" he asked, with the sort of polite hopefulness that suggested he didn't often have company. "I've managed to cultivate several local varieties that have quite interesting properties. Nothing toxic to carbon-based life forms, I assure you. I've done extensive testing." The three members of the landing party stared at him through their environmental suits, their instruments registering impossible readings while their minds struggled to process a reality that contradicted everything they knew about hostile environments, survival requirements, and the fundamental nature of interspecies relations. Somewhere in the canopy above, something that sounded like wind chimes made from living crystal began what could only be described as music. The ascent to Elias's treehouse involved a pulley system that he had obviously designed himself, using principles of engineering that worked perfectly, despite ignoring several laws of physics that the hegemony considered non-negotiable. Commander Neville found himself hauled 40 feet into the air by what appeared to be a combination of counterweights, living vines, and sheer, bloody-minded determination to make afternoon tea accessible. "Atmospheric seals are holding," Dr. Bram announced nervously as they settled onto the main platform, his tentacles interfacing with his suit's systems while trying not to touch anything that looked like it might have opinions about alien visitors. "Oh, you can remove those suits if you'd like," Elias said casually, pouring tea from a pot that appeared to be carved from a single enormous seed. "The air up here is quite breathable. I've spent considerable effort training the local atmosphere to be more accommodating to guests." "Training the atmosphere," Yuki repeated, her compound eyes processing this statement while her logical subroutines performed emergency maintenance on themselves. "Well, certainly," Elias replied, settling into a chair that had grown rather than been built. "The microbial population here is remarkably adaptable. A bit of selective cultivation, some environmental encouragement, and they've developed quite refined tastes. They prefer decomposing plant matter to visiting aliens these days." Navigator Yuki's environmental sensors indicated that the atmospheric composition around the platform was indeed within acceptable parameters for most oxygen-breathing species, which was either a magnificent coincidence or evidence that the universe had developed a sense of humor about scientific predictions. "You've been here 15 years, Neville said, keeping his helmet sealed out of professional paranoia and personal attachment to continued existence. 15 years. 7 months and 12 days, Elias corrected with the precision of someone who had been counting. "Though time moves differently when you're not commuting to an office. The local day-night cycle takes some adjustment, but the seasonal variations are quite pleasant once you learn to read them properly." "How did you survive the initial exposure?" Bram demanded, his scientific curiosity finally overwhelming his terror. The atmospheric toxins alone should have caused immediate cellular breakdown. Elias paused in his tea preparation, considering the question with the sort of thoughtful expression that suggested he was trying to explain quantum mechanics to a particularly bright child. "Well, I suppose it helps that humans are remarkably good at not dying when we're not supposed to," he said eventually. "The first few weeks were admittedly challenging. Quite a bit of what you might call aggressive biological negotiation with the local ecosystem. But humans have this useful tendency to adapt to things that ought to kill us." Aggressive biological negotiation. Yuki processed this phrase while her translation protocols wondered if they were having a breakdown. "The plants here are quite social," Elias explained, gesturing at the jungle around them. "They have very definite opinions about territory, resource allocation, and acceptable behavior from neighboring species. Once I demonstrated that I was willing to contribute to the local ecological balance rather than simply taking from it. We reached an understanding." A vine that had been hanging innocuously from the platform's edge suddenly extended itself to offer Bram what appeared to be a flower that glowed with soft blue light. "That's harmony," Elias said as Bram recoiled. "She's offering you a bloom that helps with atmospheric adjustment. Quite thoughtful, really. She remembers the last insectoid visitors having respiratory difficulties. The plant remembers previous visitors. Neville stated with the flat tone of someone whose worldview was performing controlled demolitions on itself. "Oh yes, the vegetation here has excellent memory," Elias replied, accepting a different flower from another vine and adding its petals to the tea. "Part of their survival strategy, I suspect. They catalog different species, their behavioral patterns, resource requirements, and potential for symbiotic relationships. You're describing plant intelligence that exceeds most documented examples of botanical cognition," Bram said, his tentacles twitching as they processed sensor data that kept contradicting fundamental biological principles. "Perhaps your documentation needs updating," Elias suggested mildly. "I find that most scientific conclusions work much better as starting points than absolute truths." The tea service continued with the sort of civilized normalcy that made the entire situation even more surreal. Elias served his guests from cups that appeared to have been grown rather than carved, while plants that should have been trying to digest them instead arranged themselves into more aesthetically pleasing configurations. "Are there others?" Yuki asked, accepting a cup of tea that her sensors indicated was not only safe but contained several beneficial compounds that weren't supposed to exist in nature. "Others?" Elias raised an eyebrow. "Other humans? On this planet?" "Oh, certainly," Elias replied, as if this were the most obvious thing in the galaxy. "Benji Croft has a lovely settlement about 300 kilometers south, built into a cliff face overlooking the inland sea. Brilliant engineer, that one. His water purification system uses local crystalline formations in ways that would probably give your geologists nightmares. And Ivy Sterling has established quite the community on the eastern coast. Last I heard, they were up to 47 residents and had started their own brewing industry." The three members of the landing party sat in stunned silence while their instruments registered readings that suggested not only were there multiple human settlements on this supposedly uninhabitable world, but they appeared to be thriving. "How many humans are there on Nexus 7? Neville asked, with the careful tone of someone who suspected the answer might require emergency therapy. "Never done a proper census," Elias admitted thoughtfully. "But I'd estimate somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000, scattered across the primary continent. We tend to establish settlements based on local ecological conditions, rather than traditional urban planning principles. Much more sustainable that way. 12,000 humans living successfully on a planet that 3 separate galactic civilizations had declared uninhabitable. The universe, it seemed, was having the last laugh after all. The return journey to probability's end passed in the sort of stunned silence usually reserved for the aftermath of natural disasters or particularly devastating exam results. Commander Neville piloted the shuttle with mechanical precision while his passengers sat in contemplative shock, their instruments dutifully recording impossible data that would soon give several departments of xenobiological research severe cases of professional indigestion. Captain Wex received their initial report with the crystalline equivalent of a headache. Her prismatic form refracted the bridge lighting into increasingly agitated patterns as she processed information that violated everything the hegemony thought it knew about planetary habitability, species adaptation, and the fundamental nature of hostile environments. 12,000, she repeated, her harmonic voice carrying notes that suggested her vocal crystals were developing stress fractures. Confirmed human settlements across multiple climate zones. Yuki reported with the mechanical precision of someone whose worldview had been systematically disassembled and reassembled in ways that no longer made sense. Agricultural systems, manufacturing capabilities, and what appears to be a functioning inter-settlement communication network. Using plants as message carriers, Neville added helpfully. Apparently, the local flora has developed quite sophisticated information distribution protocols. Dr. Bram's tentacles writhed as he interfaced with multiple data streams, his scientific methodology struggling to process observations that treated established biological principles as interesting suggestions rather than immutable law. The atmospheric modification alone represents a level of ecosystem engineering that our best terraforming specialists consider theoretically impossible, he announced, his translator adding harmonic overtones that suggested he was having a minor nervous breakdown. These humans have somehow convinced a planetary biosphere to modify itself for their convenience. Perhaps, Captain Wex suggested with the careful tone of someone trying to maintain sanity in an increasingly irrational universe, we should inform the Hegemony Council before drawing any conclusions. The message that eventually reached Admiral Horus of the Galactic Hegemony's Xenobiological Assessment Division was the sort of communication that tends to cause bureaucratic systems to develop spontaneous glitches. It arrived during what should have been a routine review of planetary classification standards and instead triggered what historians would later describe as the Great Taxonomic Panic of 2387. "They're living where?" Admiral Horus squawked, his avian features ruffling in agitation as he processed the initial reports. Within hours, emergency sessions were being convened across multiple star systems as the implications of Nexus 7 rippled through the galaxy's scientific establishment. If humans could survive on a Class XXX planet, what did that say about the reliability of planetary classification systems? More disturbingly, what did it suggest about the accuracy of the Hegemony's assumptions regarding species adaptability? Back on Nexus 7, Elias Hemsworth finished his afternoon tea and began his evening routine with the same unhurried precision he had maintained for over 15 years. The alien visitors had been pleasant enough, though their environmental suits suggested a rather pessimistic view of local atmospheric conditions. He made a mental note to mention their visit in his next message to the coastal settlements. Ivy Sterling would probably find their reaction amusing. Blossom padded up to the base of his tree, her orchid eyes glowing in the gathering dusk, and made the soft trilling sound that indicated she had completed her territorial rounds. The more antisocial members of the local fauna had been successfully discouraged from approaching the inhabited areas, and the evening's pest control protocols were proceeding according to schedule. "Good work," Elias called down, tossing her a piece of fruit that glowed with gentle bioluminescence. "I suspect we'll be having more visitors soon. Might want to prepare the extended hospitality arrangements." As night settled over the jungle, the canopy came alive with the sounds of an ecosystem that had learned to appreciate the benefits of interspecies cooperation. Somewhere in the distance, the crystal chimes began their evening concert, harmonizing with the gentle hum of plants that had developed musical opinions about atmospheric conditions. The galaxy's scientific establishment would spend decades studying the Nexus 7 anomaly, publishing papers on human adaptability, ecosystem engineering, and the fundamental unreliability of expert predictions. New classification systems would be developed, theoretical models would be revised, and entire academic careers would be built on understanding how the impossible had become routine. But in his treehouse, 40 feet above the jungle floor, Elias Hemsworth simply prepared for bed, secure in the knowledge that the universe was far more accommodating than most people assumed. Tomorrow, he decided, he would plant new varieties of tea herbs in the eastern garden. The local soil had been expressing interest in diversified cultivation, and Elias had always been one to listen when the environment offered suggestions. After all, 15 years of successful planetary cohabitation had taught him that the secret to thriving in impossible conditions was remarkably simple. You simply had to be too stubborn to accept that they were impossible in the first place.